This is how rulers rose, and how they fell. Candlelight stutters along the gold leaf of icons in the Kremlin's faceted chamber as snow hisses against the leaded windows. Sable-collared boyars crowd the benches beneath a ceiling painted with saints and spears, the soft rasp of beards on velvet catching in the cold air. Ink-stained clerks stand beside them, quills poised over parchment, listening for words that might rearrange a realm. At the far end, on a high seat beneath a double-headed eagle, the Tsar's shadow flutters like a pennant. His staff taps twice on the stone, and the whispering stops. A parchment is unrolled. The seal is red as a drop of blood. The Boyar Duma, Russia's council of the greatest nobles, draws a single frightened breath as the Tsar begins to speak. Because in this room, an opinion can be loyalty, and loyalty can be treason, depending on how the candlelight falls. The room smells of beeswax, fur, and damp wool. A junior clerk, wool cap askew, holds his breath as the Tsar's voice, smooth at first, tightens on certain names. Novgorod, treachery, mercy, punishment, God's will. A prince of ancient lineage whose ancestors fought under Rurik shifts on his bench. A chair leg squeals. A man from a younger service family, sword belt still trembling from the cold outside, looks down at his gloved hands. Between them stands the invisible gulf that defines Muscovy. Bloodlines and service, precedent and favor. Managed, weighed, and weaponized here in the Duma. The Tsar asks for counsel. Not commands. Counsel. That single word has saved and destroyed more men than any battle. Because to advise is to risk being blamed when the wind of fortune veers. A silence settles, the kind that makes a candle crackle loud as thunder. And the first boyar stands to speak, knowing every syllable will travel farther than the city walls. Today's story is the tale of that room and the world it ruled, the Russian Boyar Duma and the rise of the tsars. How a council of aristocrats helped shape a state that would stretch from the Baltic to the Pacific. How rulers learned to use the Duma's prestige or to break its spine. And how, in the end, a new kind of autocracy swallowed its old advisors whole. We'll walk from the smoky halls of early Muscovy through the terror-lit court of Ivan the Terrible, across the famine-black years of the time of troubles, into the careful consolidations of the early Romanovs, and finally to the hammer-stroke reforms of Peter the Great. Along the way, we'll glance sideways at Poland's rowdy Sejm, at England's stubborn parliament, at the French king's glittering council, to see what made Russia's path both familiar and singular. And we'll stand, again and again, in rooms where the air itself seems to lean in to listen, waiting to learn whether council will crown a ruler or unseat him. If you want to help me translate more stories like this, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. The Boyar Duma began as something older than its name. A prince's circle of companions, the druzhina, who ate at his table and fought at his side. In Kievan Rus, power was personal, a braided rope of kinship, sword wealth and reputation, and a prince consulted his senior warriors and leading landholders. But Kievan politics fractured into appanage principalities, and then bent under the Mongol yoke. The humbling and the harrying taught the princes of the northeast, Moscow foremost, to make counsel a habit and suspicion an art. Out of this came the Duma. Not a parliament, not a senate, but a council of the highest born, the boyars, joined by ranks with names that rolled like drums. Okolnichi, Duma nobles, Duma clerks. They advised, they witnessed, they authenticated the Tsar's will. And because legitimacy in a land of vast distances is a fragile thing, the stamp of the Duma's assent mattered more than any iron seal. Yet the Duma was never a simple echo of a ruler's voice. Its workings were structured by a social gravity called местничество, precedence, a precise venomous hierarchy that ranked men by lineage and past service. In practice, it meant a prince with great-grandfathers glittering in the memory of the court could speak before a man whose courage yesterday saved a frontier, because birth weighed more than brilliance. It was a system that could paralyze a decision with arguments over who should sit closer to the czar's chair. Watch a session in Ivan III's day. A clerk named Timofey, hands blackened with ink, waits as two grand lords trade frosted smiles and archaic citations of their grandfather's deeds to establish who may open his mouth first. The czar listens, impassive. He needs both of them, but he needs them to need him more. A nod, barely there, and the lower-ranked speaks, because the czar's favor outweighs even the heaviest ancestry when he chooses to make it so. In that nod lies the balance of Muscovite politics. Ancient privilege harnessed by new power, with the Duma as the harness and the Tsar holding the reins. The Duma's authority thickened as Moscow's did. Ivan III, the gatherer of the Russian lands, the prince who married a Byzantine princess and wore imperial purple in the shadow of the Kremlin's fresh white limestone, used the Duma like a loom. Thread by thread, he drew Novgorod into Moscow's warp, curbed the boyars who could not be bound, and published a law code that clothed custom and statute. Picture him at dawn, a map of river veins and market towns spread across a linen-covered table. The Duma ranged around him like a living compass. An envoy from a frontier monastery waits for judgment on a boundary dispute. A merchant guild petitions to curb a rival town's fairs. A land grant tied to military service, the palmistry system, is parceled out like coin to men who will ride when called. The Duma's murmured consent helps turn these decisions into policy, and those policies pull military men into the Tsar's orbit and tie land to service. That's how a loose quilt of lands begins to feel like a cloak. But under the warmth, needles remain. The old families bristle. The habit of advice is a habit of expectation. When a ruler asks how far he may go, the Duma quietly counts the cost. If you had come to Moscow in the 1540s, you would have found for a brief moment a ruler and a council trying something almost new. Ivan IV. Not yet the terrible. A boy scarred by court factions who discovered, the way a burned hand learns a stove, that council could steady him. He gathered a chosen council, men of mixed birth but clear purpose, streamline justice, check casual brutality, place guardrails on the river of the Tsar's will. The Boyar Duma, crusted with precedents, found itself sharing oxygen with this more fluid circle. The result? Reforms. A revised law code, a more regular call-up of servicemen, church councils that tried to rein in corruption and standardize practice. In scene after scene, a rhythm took shape. Petitioners in sheepskin, nobles in sable, priests smelling of incense and fish broth, the Tsar listening, asking questions, glancing toward the men he trusted, while the older boyars rearranged their beards and fumed. For a heartbeat, Muscovy pretended it could be governed by conversation. Then the conversation changed its temperature. War with Kazan and Astrakhan made Ivan a conqueror. War with Livonia made him anxious, and the sterner voice in his head grew louder. Somewhere between a bad omen and a betrayal, the young Tsar who had leaned in to hear counsel learned to love the echo of his own commands. The Oprichnina, the word sounds like a door slamming, was born in 1565. Imagine the faceted chamber again, but colder. The Tsar in black, a cross and a dog's head hung from a rider's saddle outside. Oprichniki, his set-apart men, glittering like icicles. The realm is split in two on paper. In practice, it is split by fear. A boyar rises to speak in the Duma and sees in the corner of his eye an oprichnik's fox fur hat tilt slightly. Attention or warning. A sentence dies on his lips. This was the acid poured into the Duma's gears. Counsel became risk. Men learned to mouth the Tsar's suspicions back to him, or else fall silent. In the corridors, servants whispered new politenesses over dried blood. In Novgorod, bells toll, then are torn down. The Boyar Duma survives, but as a frightened chorus in a play rewritten by one actor, and it remembers which lines lead to exile. To understand how singular this felt, glance west. In the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Sejm grew muscular as noble liberties multiplied. A single noble could shout, "Nie pozwalam," I do not allow, and a law fell dead where it stood. In England, Parliament's control of the purse forced monarchs to bargain for taxes, to plead in horse trade, to listen. In France, the king's council glittered with culture and ceremony, yet even the Sun King relied on webs of clients who expected returns. Russia knew councils, clients, and bargaining too. It also knew distances that stretched like winter and enemies at every compass point. The result was a politics in which advice was prized as legitimacy and punished as presumption, often in the same week. The Duma's chair legs sat on ice. The Tsar's breath could crack it. When Ivan IV died, his realm tottered on the nervous legs of a child Tsar in a faith tested by hunger. Famine. Grain rotting under too much rain. Fields stripped by locusts. People boiling bark and leather into a mockery of soup. Dark in the alleys of Moscow. The Duma met by candle smoke, while crowds gathered outside the Kremlin, their eyes as flat and bright as coins. Boris Godunov, a man of service rather than ancient birth, learned to measure the room with his eyebrows. He had the habit of standing half a pace behind the throne, and then half a pace in front of it. He sought the Duma's ascent to wear the crown. The Duma, worn thin by plague and fear, gave it, because sometimes legitimacy is the only bread left to eat. In the years that followed, the council would write judgments with a trembling hand, about rebellious towns, about rumors that a murdered prince lived, about Cossack bands whose songs were daggers. One night, a clerk named Ilya hears a banging at the gate and a shout. The boyars of the Duma, 7 of them, have decided to invite a foreign prince to sit in Moscow to steady the ship. He dips his quill in ink and copies out their act, heart-pounding. The 7 boyars will be remembered both as realists and as traitors, which is another way of saying that the Duma had reached the end of its rope and was tying a new knot in the dark. The time of troubles taught a brutal physics. When a throne is empty, every hand reaches for it. When famine squeezes a city, every word is weaponized. Foreign soldiers marched under banners and saints. False Dimitris, men wearing the ghost of a dead Tsarevich, were proclaimed. The Kremlin itself, for a breathless season, held as much Polish as Russian speech. The Duma tried to legislate reality back into place. It could not. And so another assembly, broader and hungrier, the Zemsky Sobor, the Assembly of the Land, met to choose a Tsar in 1613. Delegates from towns and noble districts, churchmen and warriors, argued under winter breath until a name rose through the fog. Mikhail, a Romanov youth with a famous uncle in the church. The Boyar Duma, bloodshot and exhausted, nodded. A dynasty began because a country, nearly broken, preferred a soft thread to any more swords. In the Duma's chambers, a few men wept, not for joy or sorrow exactly, but because relief has a taste like salt. The early Romanovs made a simple bargain craftily. Offer stability in exchange for service and obedience. The Boyar Duma was once again a place where petitions were heard, where policy was shaped, carefully. Walk into a session under Tsar Alexei in the 1640s, and you will smell a new intensity of paper and wax. Departments, the prikazi, multiply like winter footprints. Posolsky prikaz for foreign affairs, razryad for the army, robbery prikaz for law and order, chancellery upon chancellery. The men who run them, diaki with sharp eyes and quicker fingers, stand at the Duma benches as often as boyars do. A sea change is lapping at fur-lined boots. Administration is power, not just ancestry. Out in the streets, ordinary townsmen feel the weight of the state too, in taxes and the copper coinage that melts value like snow in a mitt. A salt tax sparks a riot. A copper currency sparks another. In the Duma, a boyar swallows hard, because he can hear the mob outside chanting a single word: justice. And he knows justice is a sword with two edges.
Then comes a thud that will echo for centuries. A great law code sealed in 1649, the ulozhenie. In a Duma chamber buzzing with heat and parchment dust, clauses are read and reread. The intent is iron. Runaway peasants are bound to the land. The search for them is without time limit. Landholder and state clasp hands over the peasant's shoulder. A myth of Russian politics says autocracy is born in cathedrals. In truth, much of it is born in rooms like this, where boyars and clerks, cautious allies, trade blanket powers for steady incomes. The Duma's ascent helps forge a nation of service. Nobles owe the Tsar their swords. Peasants owe the nobles their labor. The Tsar owes the nobles protection and advancement. And the Duma stitches the promises together with language dry as tinder. Outside the Kremlin, a peasant watches a cart of law books rumble by, and knows only that winter will be long. He does not know his sorrow has just been alphabetized. Meanwhile, the church burns with its own fire. Patriarch Nikon, giant of a man with thunder in his voice, strides into the Duma and speaks of ritual, order, the straightening of crooked letters in prayer books. Tsar Alexei nods. Boyars watch. Reforms pass that change how hands cross themselves, how hallelujah is sung. It seems like theology. Then Moscow erupts. Old believers, convinced that new rites mean betrayal, light their dissent with flame. In monasteries, men barricade themselves behind icons. Once again, council turns to crisis management. The Duma arbitrates, punishes, pleads. It also remembers. The memory is this: when a ruler wants to break something old, it helps to break the men who defend it. Nikon will fall. The message lingers. Even in the lullabies of politics, somebody is learning a sharper tune. By the 1680s, another old rule has already gone to ground. Under Tsar Fyodor III, the ancient hierarchy of mesnichestvo is abolished. A decree, a seal, and centuries of genealogy suddenly count for less than skill. A few old men in the Duma stare at their hands as if the rings have lost weight. A young noble hears the news on a training ground and laughs aloud. The meaning is simple and devastating. The Tsar wants a state that runs on merit, or at least on obedience that looks like merit, rather than on pedigrees. The Duma is pivoting, creaking but pivoting, from a council that stage aristocratic precedents to a place where administrators and generals trot facts into the room like dogs. You can almost hear the tempo pick up, and then the doors burst open. Peter, 17, tall as a spear, eyes bright with curiosity that looks like impatience, enters history at speed. He has watched Boyar clans turn the Kremlin into a chessboard. He has watched the Streltsy, Moscow's musketeers, make and unmake regencies with the offhand cruelty of a knife's edge. He has camped in a toy village with real cannons. He has built boats on a backwater and felt wind push him toward a future that has sails. In one scene, the Duma will tell and retell. He walks in, takes a handful of the old men by their beards, and jokes about cutting them. They laugh. He doesn't. Over the next years, he will turn that joke into policy. The Boyar Duma is still there when Peter begins to rule in truth, but its benches feel like furniture in a house being renovated. A new body appears. The governing Senate, a cabinet and Supreme Court in one, created while Peter is away, at war. In its design, you hear the cadence of Sweden's collegial boards and German bureaucracies. In its function, you hear Peter's voice saying, deliberation. Yes, but fast. Advice, yes, but organized. Dissent, yes, but useful. The Duma, old and prestigious, watches as decisions slide along new rails. Peter issues decrees that reach into sleeves and souls. Beards are taxed, coats are shortened. Noble sons are sent to school. Offices acquire ranks like regiments. The table of ranks turns birth into a ladder and makes talent, or at least service, another path to greatness. In a Duma chamber, a boyar's grandson fingers his shaved chin and stares at a uniformed official writing numbers instead of compliments. He understands, with a prickling clarity, that the world has tilted.
What was the Duma now? A theater of tradition, still summoned for ceremony, still useful as a stamp, still composed of families whose names could silence a room, but no longer the artery through which the state's lifeblood flowed. That blood now ran through colleges and chancelleries, through Senate decrees, through a civil service that Peter bullied into existence. The Duma's last power, perhaps, was symbolic. To stand there, under icons that smelled of candle smoke and history, and remind the Tsar that Russia had once been governed by counsel, by voices and nods and the grammar of caution. Peter looked up at those icons and kept building ships, set the Boyar Duma beside other councils, and the contrast sharpens. The Polish Sejm, chaotic and brave, turned noble equality into a kind of veto chorus that made unity a miracle. The English Parliament hardened into a partner that could revolt and behead, and then invite back, and then tame. The French king's councils glittered with ministers who built and broke systems as fast as they could imagine them. The Duma? It was always both more and less than its peers. More because the Tsar could use its assent to sanctify decisions across 11 time zones. Less because it was never the people's pocket of power, never a purse string holder, never a machine that could force a monarch to bargain if he chose not to. Russia had other fora for broad consent. The Zemsky Sobor, especially in moments of vacancy or panic. But the Duma remained a noble's room, a place where birth and service, ritual and reading, met and tried to choreograph the Tsar's dance without stepping on his boots. And yet, return to the faceted chamber one last time, and watch how politics felt in the bones. A winter morning. The bells of Ivan the Great's belfry toll, deep and heavy. A messenger from a frontier fort has brought news. A raid has struck a chain of villages, and the snow is streaked with ashes. The Tsar's face, this time a Romanov's, calmer than Ivan's, steadier than a regent's, tilts toward the benches. The Boyar Duma is asked to consider fresh levies, more muskets, new taxes on salt or tobacco. A merchant in the posad outside knows that means thinner stew for his apprentices. A noble inland knows it means his son will ride farther this spring. A priest knows it means sermons about obedience. In the Duma, a debate breaks that sounds like memory. One lord speaks of ancient rights, another of new necessities. A clerk murmurs numbers, a general speaks of powder. The Tsar rubs two fingers together as if feeling the grain of wood. He is weighing the texture of consent. The Duma's assent will not stop him if he decides otherwise. His command will cost more if they refuse. He glances at the icon of the Archangel Michael, sword drawn, and nods. The council gives its "so be it." Men start writing. Somewhere a child blows on his fingers to warm them and dreams of spring. Decisions here have that kind of echo. What were the consequences of this shared unequal labor? First, a state that could move. For all the stories of paralysis by custom, Muscovy and early Imperial Russia learned to take decisions. Harsh ones, quick ones, sometimes brilliant ones. Because a Tsar could choose to hear counsel and then dictate, not negotiate. When the choice was wise, the Duma's assent fused it to the land. When it was terrible, the Duma's assent made it seem ordained. Second, a nobility that was both empowered and bound. The Boyar Duma gave the upper crust a script and a stage. The ruler gave them roles that paid well. The law gave them peasants who could not leave. Together they built a platform high and sturdy enough to support an empire, and heavy enough to crush those beneath. Third, a political culture of caution. In rooms where words could become weapons, men learned to fence with compliments. That habit lasted. Even as the Duma dwindled, the reflex to dress hard truths as soft counsel survived in chancelleries and corridors. A final comparison sharpens the silhouette. Where the Polish Sejm's radical, noble liberty ended by shackling the state, and where England's parliament wrestled power from the crown before industrializing, Russia's path threaded between. It institutionalized advice without institutionalizing opposition. When Peter finally buried the Boyar Duma under new boards and ranks, he did not create a parliament in its place. He built a machine. That machine could achieve wonders. Armies in the field, ships on the sea, canals and frozen earth. And it could grind people down. The absence of a robust representative counterweight at the center meant that later, Duma, the 19th century city councils and the 20th century state Duma, would carry the burden of novelty, as if the word had to be taught again what it meant to say no to power. The echo of the old Boyar Duma in those later rooms is faint, but it exists. The way an old foundation can be felt under a new palace if you walk barefoot and pay attention. And yet, for all the distance of centuries, the scenes remain vivid. A boyar kneels to kiss a cross and swear counsel. A clerk sprinkles sand on wet ink and blows very gently. Snow falls in the Kremlin's courtyards, hissing like secrets. The Tsar's staff taps once, twice, and a decision slides into the future. We like to think rulers rise on their own courage and fall on their own mistakes. The Boyar Duma teaches a subtler truth. Rulers rise on networks of advice, assent, and shared interest, and they fall when those networks fray. Sometimes the Duma helped stitch. Sometimes it pulled the threads. Sometimes it stood bravely. Often it sat carefully. Always it mattered. Because in a land that large, legitimacy cannot be carried by one man's hands without trembling. The candle in the faceted chamber gutters. A clerk snuffs it with practiced fingers. Outside, the wind scrapes across the Kremlin walls. Men wrap their cloaks tighter and step into the snow, each carrying a version of what has just happened. Orders, notes, relief, dread. History will write, "The Tsar decreed," but that is a shorthand for a longer choreography. A council convened, an argument brewed, a fear glanced around the room, a nod given, a seal impressed, and 100 lives shifted by lines on paper. That is how the Boyar Duma moved the world. Not always loudly, but insistently, like a hand at the small of a monarch's back. And when the hand was withdrawn or struck away, the monarch learned what it meant to walk alone. So picture one last scene. The year is the early 18th century. A tall man in a German coat stands before a table strewn with drafts. His beard is trimmed to stubble. His eye has the glint of shipwright's iron. Behind him, the old Duma benches sit like relics. He signs a decree. The Senate will carry the work. The colleges will organize the arms. The ranks will order men by service. The old names will be spoken mostly at funerals. He sets down the quill. Somewhere in the palace, a carpenter's hammer raps 3 times. Build, build, build. The man smiles. He believes he has buried the past. He has not. It lies under the floorboards, in the grain of the wood, in the habit of councils to gather and of rulers to listen just enough. When later ages speak of the rise of the tsars, they will name wars and palaces and triumphs. But in the quiet lines between, they will be talking about rooms like this, where council became sovereignty's shadow and taught it how to walk. This is how rulers rose and how they fell.